Good to see you all. Thank you for coming. I want to lay a little bit of foundation before we show you a couple of introductory videos. In 2020, during the presidential election of Donald J. Trump and Joe Biden, most Americans thought that the election was not conducted fairly and properly. And recently, Kash Patel released a report in which he was indicating that there were plane loads of non-US citizens coming with fake IDs from places like Hong Kong and South Korea and Great Britain, and coming to vote in an election that they had no business voting in. During the US 2020 election, many people here in this country, and I think around the world, thought something was amiss. And so we really welcome and think it is entirely appropriate for our director of the FBI, Kash Patel, to be inquiring into this. And we also agree with and applaud President Trump's executive order calling for looking into what happened in the US 2020 election. What happens in the US affects the world, because the US is the leader of the world, the lone superpower. And so what happens in the US impacts the world. But as the leader of the free world, the United States also must care about what is happening in the world, and even more so when there is a connection between the US government and what is happening. Such a link exists where you have AWEB in South Korea joined by 109 countries, where AWEB has been exporting the means of election fraud to various countries around the world. As it turns out, it's not just a US issue, but the sorts of things that were happening in the US in the 2020 presidential election have been happening in a raft of countries around the world. To just give a wide range of examples, because it would take a long time to list all the examples, but to give a sample, a widespread sample geographically, you have places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you have places like Iraq, you have places like Kyrgyzstan, you have places like Ecuador, and you are spanning multiple continents just with these countries alone. But who would have thought that USAID money, USAID money, being sent to AWEB would then be used to enable election fraud? AWEB should perhaps be renamed Making Dictators Are Us, because they are making it possible for those to seize power in an undemocratic, illegal way that should be stopped. Furthermore, there has been USAID support for the National Election Commission of South Korea. Now you might think with a nice proper name like the National Election Commission that this is just a place that does a good job of running elections and there's nothing much to see in regards to what they do. Sadly, we have found that nothing could be farther from the truth. It is commonly the case when people have nothing to hide, they do not hide. That when people are confident about what they've done, they're willing to let all the sunlight come in. And typically, election monitoring teams around the world, which the US welcomes, by the way, the US welcomes election monitoring teams Taiwan welcomes election monitoring teams, that when there is nothing to hide and there is a willingness to let the sunlight in, which has been called the best disinfectant, then you have a situation where you can see free, fair, transparent elections. However, not so with the National Election Commission. And with respect to this National Election Commission, and you will get some sense of this through the videos that will be shown, you will see fraudulent operations that take place, if I may break it down, try to break it down very simply. You have electronic fraud that happens algorithmically, and then you have an attempt to make the paper ballots catch up to the manipulated electronic voting. If I were to break it down and summarize it very simply and in a very straightforward way, that is in essence how it happens. And time-wise, it mainly happens during the early voting period, where they have a different set of rules for early voting. You don't have to even vote in your district. You don't even need proper ID. The ID and fingerprints that are done are not taken seriously and discarded. There is not the ability to check and examine things. They do not disclose what is happening. And in this last election, there were many instances of voter fraud that were captured photographically, by video, by election monitors who were counting the vote count and finding significant disparities that were there. This is the sort of thing that was happening in this last election. So to provide some further context with respect to what you just saw, when voters vote in Korea, they're given a single ballot that's not stuck to any others, a single ballot that they're required by law to fold. And then when it goes into the ballot place, they're falling on top of each other and they don't get flatter the longer they're there. They pile up in there and they are not turning into pristine flat ballots. So then what are these flat ballots that are pristinely stacked on top of each other? They are manufactured, pre-printed ballots that are fraudulent. The ones that are stuck together also indicate that that was not a proper ballot, because these are supposed to be individual ballots that are used. Now, the NEC, I think, were so embarrassed by this that they took it down, but at one point they were trying to defend the pristine flat ballots by saying this is special paper that magically, after it's folded, springs back into place, is what they said. Well, this became so manifestly absurd that they took it down from their own site as an explanation. Because have you ever seen such paper? Have you ever heard of such paper? Has anyone ever invented such paper? If so, we would expect that that person should have a patent and a good deal of money from the patent, but no such patent exists. And this is not magical paper that springs back into place and is suddenly flat and pristine. But, you know, really the paper ballots are really trying to mask the electronic cheating that's happening. That's really the heart of it. If they were not, if they were confident about what they were doing, they would open up their server and allow anyone to freely see. So many people now in Korea don't trust the election commission nor the results of the election. We believe that Kim Moon-soo won the presidential election and that Lee Jae-myung lost the presidential election, but it was fraudulently stolen. So you have a criminally fraudulent organization, National Election Commission, aiding and abetting the cheating that happened to fraudulently put Lee Jae-myung into office. And we also, if you look at the broader context, you have long-time interference by the Chinese Communist Party and the North Korean cyber army. And these are cyber attacks to engage in this sort of electronic cheating because they want to turn South Korea. Well, something that's very important that I want to point out, what does this have to do with the United States? Not only is China trying to displace the United States as the world's lone superpower, but they want to make it so that South Korea would not come to the aid of Taiwan if they attack, and they want to make it easier for North Korea to be able to take over South Korea by force. There is a mutual defense treaty between the US and South Korea. This is a treaty where in Article 3, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State to the United States, together with the Minister of Defense and the Foreign Minister of South Korea, agreed that Article 3 of the Mutual Defense Treaty requires mutual cooperation and mutual response when there is a cyber attack that happens. So it includes cyber attacks. That is significant because by law then, the United States must work with South Korea to come to its aid with respect to the cyber attacks that have happened in South Korea. This is very important because according to the US Constitution, the supremacy clause of the Constitution makes the supreme law of the land the US Constitution, US statutes, federal statutes, and treaties. This is a treaty. Therefore, the US is legally bound to come to South Korea's aid and work together to turn back these cyber attacks. This is a critical point that the US has this treaty obligation. And with that, I want to pass it on to my colleagues. First, Colonel John Mills, who was the Director of Cyber Policy in the US Pentagon, and he has been on multiple election monitoring teams. Colonel Mills will have some very important things to share with you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here with you. This is a very important topic. Elections are the foundation of constitutional republics around the world, and there has to be accountability, there has to be auditability, there has to be transparency in an election. And if there is not, then the whole concept of a constitutional republic begins to fall apart. We're dealing with an international election cartel that is essentially, this is not just affecting South Korea, it's affecting America, it's facing all countries around the world. And I've been involved in elections back in the 90s in Bosnia. It was much simpler. In 2006 in Iraq, and again, much simpler, but it began to be affected by the U.S. Helping Americans Vote Act in 2002. Apparently, Americans were unable to vote before 2002, so we had to have a piece of legislation called the Helping Americans Vote Act. From that point onward, everything went downhill, and it's affected worldwide, the worldwide vote. But also I've been a court-appointed election officer and given testimony in federal cases, election cases. But in dirty counties in Virginia, I've been appointed as an election officer because of dirty counties in Virginia. But the model is really Taiwan. And I covered the January 2024 election in Taiwan. That is the model for a fair and clean election. Day of, one day, paper ballots, must show ID, everything is hand counted in front of everybody. And nothing enters any kind of electronic network until above the county level. Taiwan has 22 counties. So once it gets above the county level, that's when it gets into the computer networks. But everybody knows the count by that time. There's no debate. It's been publicly counted. Everybody knows what it is. What is going on when elections are overly complex, like South Korea, like America, that is a red flag for fraud. And I always just point to the Carter Center for Democracy, which used to be the gold standard for elections and election conduct. They seem to be uninterested when it doesn't go to a certain direction. But that is overly complex. There's no reason for this complex IT. No reason. It's dangerous. It's a danger. It's dangerous. And I just point to Kill Chain. What happened right before the 2020 election? The movie Kill Chain, where a lot of leading Democrats said election machines are dangerous to the foundation of the United States. Interesting. Okay. This is a national security issue. It's a national security issue in South Korea. This was a stolen election. It's also in America. And there's a direct connection. I want to also bring up our good friend, the Filipinos, because in 2024, the Filipino Attorney General went to the previous Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and said, hey, you have an election machine company bribing Filipino officials to use that company. I'm not going to name the company name. That's an American company. That's an American CEO. That's a violation of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And American Attorney General Merrick Garland, what are you going to do about it? Well, it put Merrick Garland in a very awkward situation. That same company, that CEO is on trial right now. So we'll see the outcome, innocent till proven guilty. But that same company has hardware and software components in the South Korean election system. That same company. Isn't that interesting? But there's a direct tie-in here. So we thank our Filipino friends because they brought a huge case. Oh, and that same company, they had sued a number of media firms, and I know this personally, from the 2020 election. Almost all those cases for that election machine company went away. Once the Filipinos complained to Attorney General Merrick Garland, and charges were brought up against that CEO and the American election machine company. So direct ties to what happened in 2020, and as FBI Director Cash Patel has pointed out, we had the FBI essentially suppressing evidence of the fake IDs made under Chinese supervision in South Korea, in Hong Kong, in the UK, and flown from Korea to Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, this is international. This is a cartel. This is a cartel that is upsetting and throwing elections around the world. South Korea is merely the most recent case. I also want to point, we've identified Wang Huning, who's a very senior member of the Chinese Communist Party, who apparently was the quarterback and director of the whole Chinese influence campaign inside of South Korea. So you have a senior Chinese Communist Party official, essentially the quarterback. This is why South Korea had agreements with Communist China for police interchange. That's why you had this sudden unexplained presence of Chinese police in South Korea. What in the world do we have Chinese police in South Korea for? It's crazy. You had all these government officials that apparently were actually overseeing the election in South Korea. Just unbelievable. South Korea, I would say, is America's closest ally and partner. Closer than any. Five Eyes, the UK, South Korea is America's closest friend and partner. And this is crazy what has gone on in South Korea. So President Trump has an election executive order. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has given guidance on what they are going to look into on election fraud. This was even before the South Korean election. FBI Director Cash Patel has identified the fraud that was suppressed. So I think we now have the legal basis for both federal law enforcement and U.S. federal intelligence looking into these matters in South Korea, in addition to the treaty obligations on cyber that the ambassador mentioned here. This is very important. These are triggering events. So this election in South Korea is not over. It is the right of a citizen in a constitutional republic to ask questions. Anytime that is suppressed, that is wrong. And I will want to point out this absolutely bizarre National Election Commission, which apparently in South Korea, we don't even have an equivalent in America. The National Election Commission in South Korea cannot be questioned by anybody, not even the government of South Korea. Candidates sign a pledge they will never challenge anything that the National Election Commission does or says in South Korea. That is a super national body that cannot be challenged. I guess the National Election Commission is the government of South Korea. This is wrong. This is wrong. We don't know who these people are. South Koreans don't know who these people are. And yet, South Korean government can be investigated. South Korean government officials can be investigated. But nobody can challenge this body called the National Election Commission. It actually goes back a number of years, basically about 1960 in South Korea. A lot of questions, but you can never have a constitutional republic that has an entity like the National Election Commission. You no longer have a constitutional republic. Thank you. Please, we have a report. It's very good. Please, section 2.3 lists a number of elements of what we consider to be the fraud, and also the first addendum in there, electionfraud.com. Very well documents what happened in South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Mills. Next, we'll have Dr. Brad Thayer, who has his PhD from the University of Chicago with fellowships at Harvard and at Oxford as well. A very exquisite scholar, if I may say so, and one who I think can also speak well into this issue, especially transparency.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Tan. Great pleasure to be here to join my esteemed colleagues today. My focus is going to be on the lack of transparency in the election that we had in South Korea on June 3rd, with early voting on May 29th and May 30th, the week before. In every democracy, the social contract is made between citizens and government, and that depends upon open, honest, and transparent elections. It's essential for stable democratic government, and as Ambassador Tan mentioned, this is a problem in many democratic states, including the United States, but was particularly acute in South Korea on June 3rd and its aftermath. And this is particularly essential for key allies of the United States, like South Korea. Last week was the 75th anniversary of the commencement of the Korean War. That was a war in which over 1 million Koreans, South Koreans, military and civilian, were killed or wounded, and a war in which over 130,000 Americans were either killed or wounded. So at this time of solemn reflection of the sacrifices made by the South Korean and by the American people, it's important to consider the event of the South Korean election, to consider the Chinese Communist Party's actions and interference in that election, and the behavior of the South Korean National Election Commission. As my colleague, Colonel John Mills, just mentioned, the NAC is not transparent. Its problems are profound, and its behavior de facto breaks the social contract between the people of South Korea and their government. The NAC is not transparent in any respect, nor is it accountable to the South Korean government. It will not permit audits of their servers. It will not permit auditing of their software, of its processes, and of its computer equipment. In early voting, as mentioned and as seen in the video, and that will be discussed in a moment by our South Korean colleagues, in early voting there were many irregularities. My colleagues have mentioned some of them, and again, my South Korean colleagues will also address these. But in early voting, as well as e-voting on June 3rd, there was evidence of double voting, evidence of proxy voting. There were abnormal ballot papers, as the video showed in some detail. There was mismanagement of ballot boxes. There were irregularities in the vote counting process, and there were anomalies in overseas voting as well. It's a long list, essentially, of major problems in this election. The gross irregularities in voting and in early voting on election day by themselves compel us to acknowledge that the election was a fraudulent one. An investigative agency must investigate the NEC, their servers, their computer equipment, and their processes. And I have to say that this is a pattern of behavior, bad behavior by the NEC, which is witnessed, of course, previously in 2020, in 2022, and 2024, and earlier South Korean elections. So, in conclusion, transparency is essential for legitimate democratic government and for the social contract that exists between all citizens of a democratic state and their government. And so it's very important for an investigative body to examine these issues, and for the NEC and for the South Korean government to provide full cooperation to address this issue. Pillar, of course, of democracy is that we must be confident of one person and one vote in any election, and the custody of that vote, of course, is going to be executed and sustained with fidelity and with the understanding that that will be a transparent process from beginning to end. The South Korean election on June 3rd fails in every account with respect to fundamental tenets of democratic vote and democratic processes. And therefore, we call in the report, again, as my colleagues have mentioned, the election was an illegitimate one. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
We'll continue on with Colonel Grant Newsham, attorney and author. He has edited multiple volumes regarding Korean election fraud and has been on this issue for half a decade. He also wrote a book that is educating many of us called When China Attacks as well. I would commend that too. But Colonel and attorney and author Grant Newsham has some valuable insights for us as well.
Thank you, Morris. I appreciate that. I'll just get going right away. This team looked into the 2025 elections in South Korea. I actually got my start in 2020, looking into the National Assembly elections there, and have looked into the 2022 presidential election, 2024 National Assembly elections, and this most recent one. And when I first went in 2020, I didn't expect to find anything. I just wanted a trip to South Korea. I'm half joking, but I didn't think there'd be anything, because elections turn out in ways you often don't expect. But in very short order, I realized that something was wrong. And it was probably the biggest surprise of my professional life, short of the Washington football team never winning a Super Bowl in 35 years. But really the biggest surprise to see how much corruption there was in the South Korean election, and I have never changed my mind since then. You have evidence all over the place. You have documentary evidence, you have video evidence, you have physical evidence in the machines, you have eyewitness testimony it's available to be examined. You have scientific evidence as well. One example, it's been alleged that the statistical outcomes of the South Korean elections demonstrate illegality. Well, the former head of South Korea's equivalent of MIT told me that, look, I tried to figure this out, and either God did it or it's rigged. And that is compelling evidence, and the evidence is there. Now, in the years that I've been looking at this, how many times has the evidence been reviewed by the media, South Korean or foreign, by the National Election Commission, by the South Korean courts? I think you know the answer, none. I'll stay here for the next 6 months if somebody can show me anyone who has looked at this evidence. Instead, what you hear is, it's baseless, it's conspiracy theories. Well, then you ask, well, did you look at the evidence? No, it's baseless, it's conspiracy theories. Well, did you look at the evidence? No. Well, this is the point at which this sort of thing just becomes either just criminal activity or just unbelievably stupid. And that's what we have seen here. So as I said, that is the answer to all of this. When someone says, oh, it's baseless, these people are making up things. Well, show me a report, show me an examination of this evidence. It's all there to be examined, and nobody ever does. Well, that tells you plenty. Now, what's at stake here? Ultimately, South Korea as a good ally of the United States. We take it for granted. You always hear it's an ironclad relationship, forged in the blood of the Korean War. The Koreans love us, never been stronger. You will hear that from all parts of the US government and elsewhere. Well, they used to say that about Venezuela before Chavez came. It was very strongly tied to the Americans. We had a military relationship. It was the hemisphere's oldest democracy, short of us. And it was just perfectly strong. And then look what happened after Chavez came. In a very short time, suddenly Venezuela is pro-Cuba, as anti-America as you can get. Is there some reason that can't happen with South Korea? No. And what you're seeing in the manipulation of the electoral process in South Korea is an effort by hardcore South Korean leftist radicals to turn South Korea into a one-party state that is aligned with the Chinese Communist Party, aligned with North Korea, and they want to break the US-South Korea relationship. That's what they want. Most people don't want it, but we've seen many cases where a ruthless group of committed radicals can move a country where most people want to go. We'll saw something similar in Turkey. Specifics vary, but Turkey is not what it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and you wonder if it's even an ally. And that is what's at stake. Yet, what all you hear is ironclad relationship, never been stronger. Well, I wouldn't bet on that. And the elections are just one tool that the leftists are using in order to take over control and move South Korea away from consensual government, away from democracy. Because they have taken over now the presidency, the National Assembly, they have an overwhelming control gotten by electoral fraud. They have the labor unions, academia, the media has been emasculated. They wouldn't even think of looking into this. The court system they've never examined any of the electoral fraud because they're afraid. You have as well big business. They're trying to get their claws into that. The South Korean military has even been put on notice. The last piece of the puzzle was the presidency. And the evidence speaks for itself. And as I said, this was a huge surprise to me to find out what was going on with South Korean elections. And I think we need to take this very seriously. Now, what can your members do, the representatives? Well, one, you can help them, just tell them something's going on here. And you can write letters, you can speak up, and hold hearings. And often some interest from the United States makes a it has a huge sort of benefit for the people who are trying to defend freedom in South Korea. So the first thing you got to do is remember that thing that I just said. When someone tells you, "Oh, this is conspiracy theories," well, show me the review of the evidence that's been done. It doesn't exist. So well, thank you very much for coming. And I really can't overstate just how serious this is. And as I said, it was a huge surprise to me, but it was. It almost, if I wasn't an adult, I'd probably cry to see what's happened in South Korea. Thank you.
So before we hit the question and answer time, I just want to mention one more thing. I had a chance to interview Secretary Pompeo about the first Trump administration. And he noted in that interview one of the failures of our time in the first Trump administration. And that failure was allowing Hong Kong to be encoiled and crushed by the Chinese Communist Party. We do not need Hong Kong 2.0 here. It is time for decisive action to be taken in regards to what is happening in South Korea with implications for the United States, the region, and the world. And with that, I'll turn it over to Henry as we have a question and answer time.
We'll give priority to congressional staffers.
And I guess the question that's going to my mind was, what's in it for them? Are these officials making money out of this? Are they the ones who are pushing who they want in office? I guess I'm just sort of confused as to what they get out of it.
Well, certainly, thank you very much indeed for the question, and certainly that is an excellent one. What the NAC gets out of it is control, of course. By being completely opaque, no one can identify, trace their methods, and there is no accountability. They're able to, perhaps working with other actors like the CCP, ensure that their favorite candidate wins the election. And so as we have stressed today, this is the source of a great problem that we face in the South Korean election, and that alone causes us to recognize that this election cannot be seen as a legitimate one if there is no transparency. Thank you.
If I might, I'd like to add to that. It is a family business. So you have a large percentage of the NEC coming from the relatives of a family. And it's also a sinecure. They don't have to do much of anything except manipulate a few elections when they occur. So in their hiring, they have passed over more qualified candidates in order to bring in family members to keep the family secrets, right? And to not spill the beans of what is going on. Picking who they want to be in power is pretty powerful, right? And when there were about 31 impeachments that were trying to prevent people from looking into it, maybe that was another world record as well. It's interesting that when they have the athletic contests within the South Korean government, who wins all the time? It's the NEC people. Why? They've got tons of time to practice their badminton skills and whatever else they're competing in. So it's a sinecure, it's a family racket, and it is a criminal fraud organization.
I'll just add one bit that you wouldn't know if you don't follow this closely. They're also incredibly vindictive and vicious. If you even say, for example, the way candidate, former Prime Minister Bong Kyo-on said, we want to have an honest election this time, you will have the police show up at your door. You will have charges brought against you. They file cases all the time against anyone who simply says something as innocuous as, how about a free election? If you raise the charges, make claims, you can stand by and you will be on the receiving end of their punishment. And I think we've got a couple of people in this room who have done that. And this is more, I think, than just trying to cover up incompetence. I believe there is, in fact, they are playing an intentional role in, as I said, turning South Korea into a one-party state. It's the vindictiveness and viciousness that we really have to remember. And it takes a lot of nerve in South Korea to stand up for a free election, sort of like here.
Anyone else with questions?
Just one quick point of order with the National Election Commission. The Chief Justice for the Constitutional Court also sits on the board of the National Election Commission. So you got a clear conflict of interest and just dysfunctional governance when you have the Constitutional Court Chief Justice. That's like the Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court sitting on the body of some kind of semi-executive branch entity thingy. And this just doesn't make any sense.
And there could have been things we ruefully note that could have been done, even public diplomacy, prior to the election that could have made a big difference. But even now, and even at this point, there are actions that can be taken if there's a will to do it. I will note that there is an understaffed administration right now who is spread thin and is dealing with kinetic hot wars around the world. But that does not make the gray zone war here, the hybrid warfare here, the taking over of South Korea any less important. In fact, we heard something curious. We heard that the State Department was prioritizing things in Northeast Asia that were important. One would think that this would qualify under both those points. And we would strongly urge Congress, strongly urge the executive branch to take some decisive actions before it is too late. You don't want to just try to lock the barn after the horse has been stolen. You want to be able to address the situation. And it's not far from the election date right now. And so can we step in and can we decisively take actions that demonstrate our treaty commitment fulfillment because you have triggering events here of cyber attacks that require, let me underscore that, require response by the United States of America to address it.
I would just add, there's also a congressional response as well, that might be useful. If USAID did give money to AWEB and to the NEC, then Chairman Comer, for example, has grounds to investigate along those lines. So the administration's response, of course, but there's a congressional response too, which I think might be very helpful.
What is extremely distressing is we have American companies such as Google, which owns YouTube, and we also have X, unfortunately, that appears to be silencing and censoring social media inside of South Korea. And I've actually contacted X, the X office of South Korea, to get their comment on this. They've not responded yet. I'll move on to the American office and the front office of X, but also YouTube, which is powerful in South Korea, but is being silenced and suppressed, like Ground C is being silenced and suppressed. And this is another avenue and vector for congressional investigation. We